Günther, and welcome, Philip. Good to see you, even if at a distance and over Zoom. It's a technology that's actually miraculous in some ways. You sit in London, I sit in Bloomington, and here we are. And lots of people all over the place tuned in for you as well. I'll introduce you briefly and then hand over for your talk. Philip Spencer taught for many years at the university, at Kingston University in Great Britain. He's trained chiefly as a political scientist, works in history as well. And for a number of years, he's focused importantly on both Holocaust studies and genocide studies. He's carried those subjects with him to Birkbeck College at the University of London, where he's presently a visiting professor as well and connected as an associate to the Pears Institute for the study of anti-Semitism. When I last spoke with you, Philip, I remember we were talking about the Labour Party and Corbyn. Corbyn is out. Whether Corbynism, however, is over and done with or has an ongoing life, we'll soon hear from you whether or not you call it by that name or not. We chatted briefly just a few minutes ago, and I mentioned our series began about 10 months ago with a wonderful presentation by your friend and colleague Dave Rich. Since Dave's presentation, also on developments in the UK, lots has happened, and we're going to learn from you, I'm sure, about some of that. Beyond the seminar itself, those of you who would like to keep up with Philip's work, he's published at least 2 books that I'm aware of on nationalism. With Robert Fine, he did a book on anti-Semitism on the left, and his most recent publication, which I just finished reading, is a slim but very clarifying study of genocide called Genocide Since 1945. Philip, I give over to you, and it'll be a pleasure to hear what you have to tell us.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much, Alvin. And thank you also, Professor Yikeli, for this, and thank you to everybody else for zooming in on this Sunday morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are, in these rather strange times. I want to talk today about, I want to go through a number of what I think are the most significant debates about anti-Semitism in the UK today. It's not an exhaustive list, but I'll try and list them first, and then maybe come to some more general conclusions at the end, at a deeper level, about the way these debates are framed and have been conducted, and what this might tell us about the nature and character of anti-Semitism today in the UK, and perhaps elsewhere. So the questions I want to look at, or the debates I want to look at, turn around the following set of questions, which, as we shall see, are in many ways interrelated, and they are the following. Firstly, there is the issue of how much anti-Semitism there is, in fact, in the UK today, and how seriously we should take it. The second question is, how does anti-Semitism relate to other forms of oppression in the UK, particularly racism? The third is, what is the meaning or legacy of the Holocaust in shaping, if it should at all, how we should and do think about and react to anti-Semitism, if anti-Semitism exists or is serious at all today? The fourth question is, what actually is anti-Semitism anyway today? And is it or is it not being confused with something quite different, or not, namely criticism of the State of Israel? And the last and fifth question is, how responsible are Jews themselves for anti-Semitism? And have they placed themselves or been placed differently to the way they were placed before, not on the side of the forces of progress, but lined up against them, not on the left, but on the right? But before I start on these questions, these debates, let me try and place them in some kind of context. We do have, thanks especially to the Community Security Trust in the UK, which is an organisation set up to monitor incidents of anti-Semitism and to protect Jews from anti-Semitism. We have from them some very good data about the incidents of anti-Semitism, anti-Semitic incidents in the UK. The CST publishes an annual report, which is always very carefully prepared and errs, if anything, very much on the side of caution. If you want to, you can find all their reports easily online, but let me quickly summarize what for me are, in the context of what I will be talking about, some quite significant findings. They are that in 3 of the last 5 years, the number of anti-Semitic incidents in the UK has hit a record level. There has been a slight drop, about 8% in the last year recorded, 2020, though that is still at the 3rd highest level recorded in recent years. But they suggest there aren't many grounds for optimism about this drop, which is probably attributable to lockdown, or the lockdowns, I should say, since we're still in the middle of them in the UK. So, given these figures, you might be forgiven that there can't be much of a debate about the first question I identified, which is whether there is any anti-Semitism and how much of it is and how seriously we should take it. If there are record numbers, then clearly there is a big problem. But there is a debate about it. Now, the debate has changed. Originally, there were methodological complaints about the way the data was being collected, about what constitutes an incident and so forth, variability in reporting, the reliabilities of monitoring bodies and so on and so forth. These days one hears less of that in the debate, and much more to do with claims that the incidence of anti-Semitism, even if it exists, and even if these figures are accurate, that the incidence of anti-Semitism, significance of anti-Semitism is being overplayed. Anti-Semitic incidents pale from this perspective into insignificance in the context of other things, and in particular in the context of racism more generally in British society. On this line of argument, there may be some anti-Semitism in the UK, but it just doesn't matter that much in the scale of things. Given what else is going on in the UK and what other groups suffer, above all in relation to the issue of racism. So this brings me to the second major area of debate, which is the question of the relationship between racism more generally in the UK and anti-Semitism. For some people, racism in the UK, to put it at its simplest, is not any longer, if it ever was, targeted against Jews, but in other groups, particularly those from Black and ethnic minority groups, what we call in the UK BAME, B-A-M-E is the acronym. But also targeted against Muslims, who suffer specifically, it is argued, or additionally from Islamophobia. Now, clearly there is some overlap here, as there are many Muslims in the BAME community, as well, of course, many who are not. So as far as those in the BAME community are concerned, and that is, the term community is a considerable simplification, by the way, since there are very many different communities grouped under this heading who have very different experiences. There are held to be, nevertheless, compelling reasons for this. Britain is seen, from this perspective, to be a fundamentally racist society, the roots of which go back to slavery and empire, and the justifications which were advanced then to justify slavery and empire, and which over time became part of the common sense of British society. People in particular from Afro-Caribbean and Indian subcontinental backgrounds very large numbers of whom have been living here for a very long time, much longer than many people like to think, actually, and in very many cases by quite explicit and targeted invitation, are the targets of racist discrimination, which it is argued is much more serious than anything Jews now face. This is, from this perspective, not an accident. There is a particular theory which for many people underpins it, which is an argument that Jews are now and have become white. While those in the BAME community have been and remain the target of sustained discrimination, Jews, it is argued, are not and have not been for some time. By contrast, it is held they have been largely and easily integrated into mainstream British society, have become unprecedentedly successful politically, socially, and economically in ways and to an extent undreamt of by those in the BAME community. Now, the argument that Islamophobia is much more serious than anti-Semitism overlaps with this in some ways, but also has some distinguishing features. At one level, the contrast here is not so much or only between those experiencing slavery and empire, although it may be in part, as between the conflict between a supposedly arrogant and intolerant Christian West and the Islamic world. Again, in passing, that's not really only one world, but let that pass for the moment. At another level, or certainly compounded by the conduct of Western states, and that is not just the United States, you'll be glad to know, but also its most loyal ally, Britain, in the so-called war on terror that supposedly pitted the same arrogant and intolerant Christian West against the Muslim world. Muslims living in the UK on this line of argument have been viewed with far greater suspicion and with much greater hostility than Jews, whose supposedly common heritage with Christians in the form of shared so-called Judeo-Christian values or civilization, have made Jews seem by contrast no threat at all, indeed quite the reverse. On the other side of this debate, there is profound disagreement with this line of argument, but not generally because people who disagree think that Britain does not suffer from racism. Very few in Britain today argue openly that that is the case, that Britain is not a racist society. At best, although that's not quite the right term to use, they argue that considerable progress has been made on the issue of racism in recent decades, and that focusing exclusively on what those in BAME communities suffer is disproportionate, as in the argument that it is not an issue of Black Lives Matter, but that all lives matter. It needs to be noted, however, that the main Jewish organizations have not actually taken this line at all, but indeed have taken several initiatives, especially in the last year, to seek to address the issue of anti-Black racism within their own organizations and communities. The disagreement really is about a set of objections which are rather different to the efforts to contrast anti-Semitism with anti-Black racism, to the point at which anti-Semitism is not seen as significant or serious. What are these objections? The first, and I'll keep coming back to this as we go through these debates, is that it does not need to be and should not be an either-or question or a zero sum. That one takes anti-Black racism seriously does not per se mean that one should not take anti-Semitism seriously and vice versa. They're not mutually exclusive propositions. The second, which is a mainly empirical objection, is that this line of argument ignores all those in the UK, Jews in the UK, who are not in fact economically, socially, and politically successful. And the third, which is a more conceptual objection, is that the concept of whiteness, often deployed in this argument, is itself quite problematic. and might even be seen in certain respects to be essentialist, if not even racist. And there are two further arguments. The fourth objection, and Karin Sturgener, who I think may be here today, has recently made this point quite brilliantly, in my view, is that this formulation is too often constructed as part of a binary and essentialized view of the world, which structurally excludes Jews and anti-Semitism from specific consideration. Anti-Semitism in this binary construct effectively and almost magically disappears from view. Part of this conjuring effect, so to speak, is that Jews in the UK are never identified as being part of the BAME community. But as the E in that acronym suggests, this is quite hard to justify, to put it mildly. And there is a book I recommend to people by comedian David Baddiel, which came out recently, called Jews Don't Count, which makes this point very clearly in ways that I confess even I not really contemplated. And there are some quite amusing examples of what will follow if you exclude the Jews from the BAME community. The fifth objection is that this way of thinking ignores the extent to which there is in the BAME community, and arguably more seriously among a minority of Muslims in the UK, a level and form of anti-Semitism which cannot be taken seriously in this frame of reference. This is not, I must stress, to argue that all Muslims in the UK are anti-Semitic, which is obviously nonsensical and deeply wrong, but only to point that some are, and specifically those influenced by a particular, in my view, perverse, but certainly fundamentalist view of Islam, whose explicitly anti-Semitic dimension has to be thought about in its own right. And finally, there is the problem, even if we accept the problematic notion of whiteness, of when exactly Jews are supposed to have become white. It seems to be that this has been since the Holocaust, for reasons which take us on to a third area of debate, which is how the Holocaust has been understood, what its meaning is or ought to be for Britain's Jews and others, and how it informs or does not inform understandings of and reactions to anti-Semitism in the UK today. Now, this is obviously a very complex set of issues, and you will, I hope, forgive me for simplifying here in the time I have available. But it has come to have quite a lot of traction of late, both in political debates in and around the left specifically, and notably in the Labour Party, and more recently in the university sector, so maybe of some particular interest to many of you attending, in quotation marks, here today. So, on the one side of this debate, there are those who think that the Holocaust essentially put an end to anti-Semitism. And after the Holocaust, there was a taboo instituted on anti-Semitism. And anti-Semitism became something which was and still is and remains confined to the political margins, above all to the far right. Now, it may be conceded that in particular or exceptional circumstances, it may be revived there, as part, for example, of a revived or resurgent xenophobia that one found, for example, in the debate about Brexit. But even here, anti-Semitism is not, from this perspective, seen as central. At best or worse, it is coded in terms of as a form of as to do with globalization, and not overtly expressed as anti-Semitism. It is not on this line of argument that the Holocaust itself put an end to racism, so this is where the arguments connect. Indeed, it is strongly emphasized that it did not, but in a way that effectively minimizes the problem of anti-Semitism itself. How so? Because the Holocaust on this line of argument needs to be seen as essentially an extreme, but by no means isolated case of racism, of which anti-Semitism is only one expression, just as Jews were only one of the Nazis' many victims. And the problem here is that it is argued that you can make far too much of what happened to Jews in the Holocaust. Hard to think of how that can be, but there you go. But what is argued here is that what happened to Jews was not, as is sometimes claimed, although this is very rarely the case today, that unique. It is not just that there were other victims of the Holocaust, of the Nazis, but that the Holocaust formed part of a wider imperialist project in which the Nazis were attempting to do what Western states had already done outside Europe. And on this interpretation, that explains why the killing sites, the extermination sites, were in Eastern Europe, which is where the Nazis were attempting to build their empire. So what shocked people, and on this line of argument, and still shocks people, is that it happened in Europe. But that in turn tells us something that may fit in with something we've already been discussing, which is that the Holocaust was a solely European phenomenon and might also be understood as a white-on-white crime, since Jews are, on this definition, also white. What follows then, if we are on this line of argument to learn the lessons of the Holocaust, is that we need to see the Holocaust in a much broader, universalist, not particularist frame of reference. If we are to remember the Holocaust, to think about the significance of the Holocaust, it follows, we should not go on so much about what happened to Jews, which is a particularist question, but we need to think about the wider issue of racism, whose main victims today certainly are not Jews. Now, this line of argument has a number of possible consequences or implications for thinking about and reacting to anti-Semitism today. One is that if we are to remember the Holocaust, we should do so not in isolation, but not by focusing too much, if at all, about what happened to Jews, but in conjunction with other genocides and to what happened to so many others whose suffering is arguably all too often eclipsed. And this has led to some calling, particularly on the left, to replace Holocaust Memorial Day with a Genocide Memorial Day. A second implication is that there may be a grave danger about going on about what happened to the Jews if the right lessons are not met. The danger lies precisely, or even in perhaps especially the victims of the Holocaust, the Jewish victims of the Holocaust, that is, in not understanding that the Holocaust was about racism. And there are those who argue in the UK that it is precisely Jews who've been the ones who've not learned these lessons. What they have supposedly done instead is effectively internalize the logic of Nazism, of racism, and use what was done to them to replicate it, to perform exactly the same racist attitudes, and by the same racist attitudes the Nazis had towards them, to others, and in particular to the Palestinians. From the other side of the debate, and again, excuse me for simplifying this, there are some very fundamental counter-arguments to this. The first is that it seems quite clear to others that anti-Semitism is no longer a taboo. Some people think it never was, actually, but we can come back to that in a minute. It is quite clearly no longer today confined to the far right, but is evident in a number of other parts of the political spectrum, especially when you cast the net globally, including the far and indeed not so far left. Actually, it was never confined after the Holocaust to the far right, as a most cursory discussion of anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union would tell you, where the Soviet Union developed its own virulent form of anti-Semitism from the late 1940s on, although of course it was apparent long before that. The second objection is that thinking about anti-Semitism in the Holocaust as racism is dangerously simplistic. On the one hand, it runs the risk of seeing anti-Semitism as a form of racism, which is quite reductive. It reduces racism here to the justification of imperialist murder and exploitation, which is certainly one of its forms, but only one. That way of thinking about racism does not address the specificity of anti-Semitic racism, in which Jews are seen to be at one and the same time subhuman vermin and superhuman possessed of extraordinary power. In the Nazi mind, after all, Jews were responsible for both capitalism and communism, dominating not just the so-called plutocratic states of the United States and Great Britain, but also Stalin's Russia. But even to treat anti-Semitism as only racism is itself quite problematic, since it leaves out so many crucial elements and tropes, including religious ones, nationalist ones, and even anti-Western imperialist ones, which the Nazis drew on effectively in making their genocidal appeal to so many others. The third objection is that the focus on empire and slavery, and empire and colony rather, in understanding how and why and where the Holocaust happened is also potentially seriously misleading. It is true that the killing sites were largely in Eastern Europe, but Jews were taken there to be murdered from across Europe and would have been taken from further afield, notably North Africa, if the Nazis had been able to do so. And that points to something else, which is that the Holocaust was not a purely European phenomenon. The Nazis had plans for the Jews which went far beyond Europe. Theirs was a global project, not a European project, not against fellow whites, but against the people whose total annihilation they sought, not just, as imperialists typically did, to steal resources or territory or exploit people. The fourth objection is that the lessons to which we are directed on this line of argument are therefore not quite right, to put it mildly. At one level, and this is to go back to the zero-sum point, it is a matter of simple recognition of what is already happening. As a matter of simple fact, Holocaust Memorial Day is used every year to inspire reflection on other genocides. Rwanda, Cambodia, Yugoslavia, and so on and so forth. But it does so rightly from this perspective in a way that neither diminishes the significance of what was done to Jews, nor turns Jews into today's perpetrators, which from this critical perspective is utterly perverse, what some people have described as Holocaust inversion. And this brings me to the fourth debate I want to talk about, which has to do with what is anti-Semitism anyway today? And is it or is it not being confused with something quite different, namely criticism of the State of Israel? Now, there is a great deal I could say about this, and I don't have time to go into much detail. And a fuller examination of this issue would clearly require an extended discussion of the vexed question of the distinction that may or may not exist between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. But this is a debate which has been going on for a very long time and is therefore not only contemporary. What I want to focus on here is a particular aspect of this debate in the UK, which arises out of the way the Holocaust and the significance of the Holocaust is understood. But I will start by looking at this debate from the other angle first. The impetus for Holocaust Memorial Day came largely from the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, an organisation which eventually took it upon itself, not out of the blue, of course, but following the efforts of others, to alert states and a whole raft of transnational and subnational organisations to the potential for anti-Semitism in the contemporary world. It thought that a good start would be made by attempting to define anti-Semitism in a way that could help such organisations and others think about the question of anti-Semitism and decide for themselves with guidelines about what to do if they felt there was sufficient indication that anti-Semitism was involved. And that definition has now become the focus of a major debate in the UK today. It first surfaced inside the Labour Party, which under the leadership of a steadfast anti-Zionist Jeremy Corbyn, objected strongly to the inclusion in the definition of examples of anti-Semitism few out of an indicative, exhaustive, and not exhaustive list, which could be taken to indicate the presence of anti-Semitism, and that were related to particularly radical criticisms of Israel. But the reason these examples were included, along with others, is because Ira believed, as do many others, that in the contemporary context, not only is anti-Semitism no longer a taboo, but it is often in the context of certain very radical criticisms of Israel that anti-Semitism is today to be found. It specifically does not say that all criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic, only that some particular forms of it could be. And what this claim involves is a recognition that anti-Semitism can take many different forms, as it has done over time. And that today, after the Holocaust, anti-Zionism is one of the forms it can take. And the argument also assumes that after the Holocaust, anti-Zionism may not have the same meaning it did before. In other words, that the Holocaust has changed a great deal. After the Holocaust, and Jews live in a different world, one in which a Holocaust was possible and did happen. On the other side of this debate, we find a very different view. Firstly, there is the argument that the definition of anti-Semitism put forward by Ira is dangerously vague and imprecise. Secondly, that it willfully and systematically conflates anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. Thirdly, that the emphasis on Israel in the examples is quite disproportionate. Fourthly, that it deliberately and dangerously restricts the freedom of those who legitimately find so much to criticize in how the state of Israel behaves. Now, many of those taking this line of argument were and still are to be found inside the Labour Party, and certainly in its leadership echelons after Jeremy Corbyn, a staunch anti-Zionist, became leader in 2015. And they fought very hard to resist what they saw as the imposition of this definition on the party, but were eventually forced to concede after an unprecedented campaign mounted by the Jewish community in the UK. It was unprecedented because it's never been the case in my lifetime, and I'm getting on a bit now, the Jews have ever done anything like they did in the summer of 2018. Which is to gather together in public outside Parliament to protest against anti-Semitism. Typically, Jewish organizations operate behind the scenes and keep very, very quiet and do not come out publicly. So this was an extraordinary change of tactic, and it followed years of anxiety in the Jewish community about the anti-Semitism that they felt was apparent in the leadership of the Labour Party. The Labour Party, as I say, was forced to concede and adopt the IRA definition, which had already been adopted by the UK government, the Scottish government, the Welsh Assembly, the Crown Prosecution Service, and so forth, and indeed a huge number of Labour Party controlled councils. But the debate has not stopped and has now migrated from the political to the university sector, though of course many of the protagonists there are also engaged politically, not least on this issue. And in the university sector, in the more academic context, we find at least two additional arguments being advanced today. One is that the definition, which was bad enough from this point of view in its imposition on the Labour Party, has a particularly chilling effect in universities because it threatens sacrosanct principles, that of free speech and the right of those working in universities to hold and express opinions without fear of censorship or sanction. And the second additional argument is that the definition is also wrong because it will do nothing to protect Jews from anti-Semitism, but rather the reverse. Because the adoption of the definition by universities will privilege Jews and anti-Semitism when others, on this argument, suffer far more from the real racism that permeates British society at all levels. Now, at this point, it would be quite wrong for me to hide the fact that I have intervened myself directly in this debate, so I won't say much more about it here, but I'm happy to take questions if necessary. What I want to say is one thing because it has to do with the next debate, which I want to touch on, and that has to do with how responsible the Jews are themselves for anti-Semitism. This is the last debate really I want to look at. Have they placed themselves, or have they been placed, not on the side of the forces of progress, but lined up against them? Now, echoes of the argument that highlighting anti-Semitism and making it a priority in the UK today will make anti-Semitism worse, and the argument that suppressing criticism of Israel is illegitimate can also be found in this debate, which is who is or who is not responsible for anti-Semitism in the UK today. On one side of the debate, there are those who argue that actually it is all too often Jews who are responsible for provoking anti-Semitism. And they do so, it is argued, in a number of ways. The first is that the main reason for anti-Semitism is how the state of Israel behaves towards the Palestinians. And such behavior is held by many to include committing the very worst crimes we know of: crimes of war, the crime of apartheid, which is a crime against humanity, and even genocide. So, when people get angry about the state committing crimes of this magnitude, it is argued, it is only understandable that people become anti-Semitic. Secondly, in promoting the issue of anti-Semitism the way they do, as in the Ira case, Jews do so at the expense of other much more vulnerable groups. But thirdly, the argument that the left, the Labour Party, has now become anti-Semitic is used on this argument, it is claimed, by the left's opponents to smear those actively seeking radical and necessary change in the UK. And fourthly, therefore, follows, on this line of argument, what has happened is that Jews have become allies of the right with those who seek to preserve the status quo. And that's not surprising, and here the arguments are interconnected, because Jews have done quite well from the status quo when they became white. So where Jews might once have been found on the left, they have now turned themselves into enemies of progress, a major obstacle to radical change, and not just in the UK. On the other side of the arguments are those, and again in the interest of full disclosure, including me, who argue that all of this is fundamentally wrong. Why? For a number of reasons. Firstly, what the state of Israel does is not a legitimate reason for attacking Jews. The state of Israel, like other states, can be criticized for what it does, but the way it is attacked is utterly disproportionate. There are states, for example, which do commit genocide in the world today. China, for example, Myanmar, for example, but not Israel. And on the other hand, what the state of Israel may or may not do is not a legitimate reason to attack Jews outside Israel, who may or may not support it. And if they do support it, it is because the existence, not the particular set of policies which any state may be pursuing at any one time, the existence of the state is fundamentally and existentially important to them as Jews after the Holocaust. Furthermore, the suggestion that anti-Semitism is somehow understandable or excusable is both shocking and dangerous. It is part of a form of reasoning which sees anti-Semitism as at some level potentially progressive. People may start out on this line of argument being anti-Semitic because they understandably object to how Jews supposedly behave. But then they might be won over to a wider cause and see that how Jews behave is part of a bigger problem with the way society is organized. This line of argument used to be called the Socialism of Fools, but that was a particularly dangerous formulation because it identified anti-Semitism as a form of socialism, albeit a stupid one. But it has now morphed into what the late Moshe Postoni called the anti-imperialism of fools, because of the way Israel is seen by many people as a central element in the oppressive imperialist ordering of the world, as a tool of Western interests in the Middle East, or even worse, vice versa. But there's also the problem that highlighting the issue of anti-Semitism, which is a real present and pressing issue, is not per se, here we come back to the zero-sum question, not at the expense of much more vulnerable groups. It can, in fact, act in exactly the opposite way to what is suggested, not as an obstacle to treating other forms of racism or oppression seriously, but as an incentive to do more on other issues. And lastly, not quite lastly, thirdly, the smear suggestion is itself potentially anti-Semitic or actually anti-Semitic, inasmuch as it suggests a malign intent, even a conspiracy between Jews and others seeking radical and necessary change, seeking to prevent radical and necessary change in the UK. This was bad enough before the shattering defeat of the Corbyn-led Labour Party in the last election. But those who put forward this argument today are coming close to a form of stab in the back theory that we may know all too well from Weimar Germany. And lastly, and I'm going to end on these points, a left which refuses to take anti-Semitism seriously is itself not at all progressive. It is a perverse form of left-wing politics that ends up casting Jews in this way as the enemies of progress. But I will end on this. It is not new. If we dig beneath these debates, we may see a familiar pattern emerging on one side of these arguments. It is one in which Jews firstly invent suffering where it doesn't exist, since it supposedly doesn't exist today, and or make too much of it, exaggerating the harm done to them. Secondly, they use these arguments, as they've always done, to promote their own selfish interests at the expense of others, today in the form of other suffering racism and the common good. Thirdly, once again, they are doing so dishonestly, only now abusing the meaning and legacy of the Holocaust. And they are doing, fourthly, this for malign purposes in defending the worst state in the world. And actually, on this line of argument, they are themselves responsible for anti-Semitism, having lined themselves up with the most reactionary forces in the UK and indeed globally. But what links these arguments, I think, today and in the past, is that together they form the core of what used to be called the Jewish question, in which Jews were cast and are being cast again as a problem that had and has to be solved one way or another. The question that I've argued before has returned with a vengeance. But there never has been a Jewish question. What there has been, and there is now again, is an anti-Semitism question. Jews are not in the UK and never have been responsible for anti-Semitism. Anti-Semites are. I'll stop there. Thank you.